Hello there. Tonight I'll be reading you a sleep story you may have heard somewhere in childhood. The Frog Prince, one of the old tales gathered by the Brothers Grimm, first set down in print more than 200 years ago. It's the kind of story that has lived in nursery books for generations. A princess, a golden ball, an old stone well in a quiet garden, and a small green frog who has rather more to say than one might expect. A little stranger perhaps than you remember, and gentler too. And by the way, if you'd like more stories like this one, you might want to check out our app. It's called Tonight, and it has fresh stories for you every day, so there's always something new to fall asleep to. Plus, you can hear them in your favourite voice. It's a free download, the link's just below this video. Before we get started, take a few moments to get cosy and comfortable. Allow your muscles to relax. Soften your shoulders. Let your hands rest. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. In a kingdom whose name has been forgotten, there stood a stone palace at the edge of a great wood. The palace was not large, as palaces go. It had 3 round towers, a long hall with a black slate floor, and a kitchen garden tucked behind a south-facing wall. The road to the village ran past the gate. The forest began where the road ended, dark and deep and very old. The king was a quiet man. He had a neat beard and careful hands, and he liked to be in bed by the time the lamps were lit. The queen had died some years before. The king kept her portrait in the long hall, where the afternoon light fell across it for an hour each day, and he passed it each day on his way to supper. He had several daughters. The youngest was called Elise. She was 15 that summer, with fair hair that her nurse plaited in the mornings. She was the king's favourite, though he tried not to let the others see. Elise had a golden ball. It had been a gift from her grandmother in the last year of the old queen's life. It was the size of a small apple, perfectly round and quite heavy for its size. It was real gold, soft enough to leave a small thumb mark if you pressed hard. She didn't press hard. She kept the ball in a velvet pouch by her bed, and when she walked in the garden, she carried it loose in her hand and tossed it gently into the air and caught it. That is where this story begins. With the ball, and with the garden, and with the warm summer afternoon. The palace garden ran down from the south wall in 3 soft terraces. There were beds of lavender, and a row of clipped box, and a long grass path that led to a linden tree planted by the king's grandfather. The linden was very old now. Its trunk was 3 arm spans around. Its leaves were small and heart-shaped, and in summer they smelled of honey, and the bees came in their slow hundreds to work in the upper branches. Under the linden there was a well. The well was not used any longer. The palace had a deeper one in the kitchen yard, with a wheel and a chain. This older well had been left to the garden. Its stones were grey and pale green with moss. Its mouth was wide and dark. A low wooden cover lay tilted across one side, and the other side was open, and you could lean over it and see down into the cool, quiet water far below. Elise often came to the linden in the warm part of the afternoon. The shade was deep there. The bees worked in the branches overhead. She would sit on the grass with her back against the trunk and toss the golden ball up and catch it, up and catch it, and watch the small green light flicker across her hand each time the ball passed through a patch of sun. On this particular afternoon, the air was very still. The bees were working steadily. Somewhere beyond the wall, a wood pigeon was calling, and somewhere closer, a thrush was answering. The sun fell in long, flat panels through the leaves, and the grass was warm, and Elise tossed the ball up and caught it and tossed it up again. She tossed it a little higher than she meant to. The ball turned slowly in the air, and the sun caught it, and it came down past her hand and bounced once on the grass and rolled along the slope toward the well. She got up to follow it. She was still calm. The ball rolled neatly and slowed at the edge of the stone rim. For a moment it sat there in the moss. Elise reached for it. The ball moved a little and then tipped over the rim and was gone. There was a small, soft sound from very far down. Then there was nothing. Elise stood at the rim of the well and looked into it. The stones went down a long way. The water at the bottom was a small, dark coin of light. She could not see the ball. She could not see anything but the dark water and her own face very small at the top of the well, and the heart-shaped leaves of the linden bending in. She sat down on the moss beside the well, and she began to cry. She cried quietly. She wasn't the kind of girl who made a fuss. She cried because the ball had been her grandmother's, and because she had been careless with it, and because the well was very deep and the water very far, and there was nothing she could think to do. "Princess," the voice said, "what is the matter?" It was a small voice and slightly damp, and it came from somewhere near her elbow. Elise turned her head. On the rim of the well, half in the moss and half on the stone, sat a frog. He was about the size of her fist. He was green-brown along the back and pale cream underneath. His eyes were dark and round, with a thin band of gold around each one. He sat frog still, his small front feet placed neatly on the stone. Elise wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I have lost my ball," she said. "It rolled into the well, and the well is very deep, and I shall never see it again." The frog considered this for some time. He blinked slowly, one eye and then the other. "I can fetch your ball," he said. Elise looked at him. "You?" she said. "The water is no trouble to me," said the frog. "I know the bottom of this well better than anyone. I can find your ball and bring it up. But I should like something in return." "I have pearls," said Elise. "I have a string of pearls and a silver comb and a small enamel box my sister gave me. You may have any of them." "I have no use for pearls," said the frog, "or for combs, or for boxes. I should like instead to be your companion. I should like to eat from your plate at supper and drink from your cup and sleep on the pillow beside yours." Elise looked at the frog. He sat very still on the rim of the well. The bees hummed overhead. A small breeze moved through the linden and the heart-shaped leaves turned a little, and the panels of sun shifted on the grass. "Yes," she said, "I promise." The frog watched her for a moment longer with his dark, gold-ringed eyes. Then he turned and slid neatly over the rim of the well and was gone. For a long minute there was nothing. Then, far down at the bottom of the well, there was a small splash. Then another. Then nothing for a long moment. Elise leaned over the rim and watched. The water shifted a little. Something moved across it, something dark and something gold. A moment later the frog came up over the rim. He had the golden ball balanced carefully on his back between his shoulders. He set the ball down on the moss beside her. Elise picked it up. It was wet and cool and beaded with water from the deep place where it had been. She held it against her cheek a moment. The gold smelled faintly of stone and of clean, cold water. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, frog." She stood up. She was already half turned toward the palace. "Wait," said the frog. "Take me with you." But Elise was not listening. She had her ball back. The afternoon was warm. The bees were working in the linden. The frog was a frog, and surely no one expected a princess to honour a promise made to such a small, green creature in such a quiet corner of the garden. She walked up the grass path, past the lavender, past the box hedge, and through the south door into the cool of the palace. She didn't look back. The frog sat on the moss for a long time after she had gone. He stayed where he was. The bees worked on overhead, and the sun shifted in the leaves, and the small thrush called once more from beyond the wall, and was answered. Supper that night was laid in the long hall. It was a small supper by palace standards. The king sat at the head of the table in his careful way. The eldest princess sat at his right hand. The middle sister sat next to her, and then a place was left, and then Elise, with her golden ball on the bench beside her, half hidden under a fold of her gown. The candles had been lit, though the windows still held a little blue from the long summer evening. The hall smelled faintly of beeswax and of the rosemary that the cook had laid across the trout. There was a soup of pale leeks. There was bread. There was a small dish of early raspberries, and a pitcher of clear water, and a heavier pitcher of wine for the king. Elise was hungry. The afternoon in the garden had been long, and she had walked back up the slope quickly, and she had not yet quite settled. She ate her soup carefully, and listened to her sisters talk about a hunting party that was to come the following week, and watched her father break his bread. It was while the trout was being brought in that there came a small, soft sound at the door of the hall. It was not a knock exactly. It was more like a tap. Pat, pat, pat. Then silence. Then pat, pat, pat again. The steward, who was an old man with very white hair and very black eyebrows, set the trout down and walked the length of the hall to the door. He opened it. He looked out, and then he looked down, and then he closed the door, and he came back along the hall with a strange, small expression on his face. "Sire," he said, "there is a frog at the door." The king looked up. "A frog?" "A frog, sire. He says he has come to see the youngest princess." Elise had gone very still. She was holding her spoon halfway to her mouth, and she set it down very carefully so that it did not make a sound against the bowl. Her sisters were watching her now. Her father was watching her too. "Elise," said the king, "do you know anything of this?" The truth came up in her throat, slow and warm. She set down the spoon. She folded her hands in her lap. She told her father, in a small, steady voice, what had happened that afternoon. The ball, the well, the frog on the rim, the promise. The king listened. He did not interrupt. When she had finished, he sat for a while with his hand on the stem of his glass, and he looked at the candle in front of him, and then at the empty place beside Elise. "A promise," he said slowly, "is a promise. Even one made to a small green creature at the edge of a quiet well. Especially that one. Open the door, please." The steward, who had stood very still through all of this, bowed once and went back to the door and opened it. The frog came in. He came in slowly, in the careful hopping way of frogs, his small wet feet making the same soft pat, pat, pat on the slate floor. He crossed the long room in many small hops. He paused once in the middle of the hall and looked up at the candles, and then he went on. He stopped beside Elise's chair. "Princess," he said, "you said I might eat from your plate." Elise's hand had closed quite tightly on the edge of the table. Her father was watching her. So were her sisters. So were the steward and the cook's boy at the side door. She loosened her hand. She bent down. She put her 2 hands around the frog, very gently, and she set him on the table beside her plate. This is the part of the story where time slows. A fresh plate was brought. The cook had cut a thin, small piece of the trout, and a small spoon of leek soup in a side dish, and a single raspberry on a white napkin. The steward set this down at the edge of the table where the frog could reach it. The frog regarded it carefully. He began to eat. He ate slowly. Frogs eat in a particular way, with small tongue flicks and small swallows, and a long pause between mouthfuls. The frog ate his piece of trout in 7 slow flicks. He drank a small amount of the soup, leaning his whole face into it briefly, and coming up with a pale leek strand, which he chewed at length. He tried the raspberry. He ate half. He set the other half down and rested. Elise watched him. At first she watched him from the corner of her eye. Then, after a while, she watched him plainly. He was a very small creature in the middle of a great deal of polished wood. The candlelight made small, soft shapes on his back. His gold-ringed eyes blinked slowly, one and then the other. The king ate his trout. The eldest princess ate hers. The middle sister buttered a piece of bread very carefully and did not look at anyone. The steward stood by the door with his hands behind his back. When the frog had eaten as much as he could eat, which was not very much, he sat for a while on the white napkin and watched the candles. "Princess," he said, after a long, quiet time, "you said I might drink from your cup." Elise looked at her cup. It was a silver cup, set with a small piece of blue stone in the handle. There was clear water in it, drawn that afternoon from the deeper well in the kitchen yard. She picked it up. She set it down carefully beside the frog. He leaned forward, carefully, and dipped his small mouth into the water and drank. He drank in small, tidy swallows. The cup was much bigger than he was. He paused between sips and went back to it again. When he had finished, he sat back, and a single bead of water slid down his throat and was gone. The candles burned lower. The blue had gone out of the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, the cook's boy was washing the soup pot, and the sound came in through the door, very faint. "Princess," said the frog, "you said I might sleep on the pillow beside yours." The eldest princess set down her glass. The middle sister bit her lip. The steward looked at the floor. Elise sat very still. She thought of her bedchamber, the pale curtains, the 2 pillows on the bed, the candle on the small table, the window that looked out across the kitchen yard toward the linden tree. She thought of a small wet frog on a clean linen pillow, and the thought was not as terrible as she had imagined, when she had imagined it at all. It was only a thought of a frog on a pillow. He was small. He was tidy. He had eaten his trout in 7 flicks. "Father," she said. "A promise," said the king again gently. "Even that one. Especially that one." Elise nodded. She stood up. She bent and put her 2 hands around the frog very carefully, and she lifted him from the table. He was light. He weighed less than the golden ball. He sat in her cupped hands and looked at her with his gold-ringed eyes, and he didn't move. She carried him from the hall. The corridor to her bedchamber was long. There was a runner of dark red wool down the centre, and small painted panels along the walls, and a window at the far end that showed the kitchen garden, and beyond it the dark mass of the linden tree against the last pale stripe of evening sky. Elise walked slowly. The frog sat in her hands without moving. The wool of the runner made no sound under her slippers. Somewhere far away, the candles in the hall guttered as someone closed the door. Her bedchamber was small and warm. The nurse had already turned down the bed. 2 pillows lay side by side on the white linen. The candle on the small table burned steadily. The window above the writing desk was open a finger's width, and the night air came in smelling of cut grass and of stone and of the linden's faint honey. Elise stood for a moment in the middle of the room. Then she crossed to the bed, and she set the frog down on the second pillow. He sat there. He looked very small. The pillow was a clean white pillow, and he was a small green-brown creature, and the candle threw a soft round shadow of him onto the linen behind. "Princess," he said very quietly. "Thank you." Elise did not answer. Her voice felt unsteady. She undressed slowly behind the wooden screen in the corner and put on her nightgown and brushed out her hair with the silver comb and washed her face in the basin. The water was cool. She dried her face on a piece of soft linen. When she came out from behind the screen, the frog was still sitting on the pillow exactly where she had set him. She lay down on her side of the bed. For a long while she did not sleep. She listened to the night. She heard a single owl call from the forest. She heard the kitchen door close and the cook's boy walk along the path with the empty milk pail, and the gate squeak and the gate close again. She heard the small, soft breath of the frog beside her, which was not really a breath she could have heard, but which she imagined she heard, the way one imagines small things in the quiet at the end of a long day. She was nearly asleep when the frog spoke again. "Princess," he said, "are you afraid of me?" She thought about this carefully. The candle had nearly gone out. The window was a pale grey square, and the linden was a darker grey shape against it, and the room smelled faintly of beeswax and of cut grass. "No," she said, "not any longer." "Good," said the frog. "Sleep now." And she did. It happened first in small things. In the second night, Elise woke before dawn and found the frog still on his pillow, but his eyes were closed. He was asleep. He looked in the grey light very slightly less green. There was the faintest cast of pink along his small throat, like a colour seen through milk. She watched him for a while. Then she lay down again, and she slept. On the third evening at supper, the frog ate from her plate again. He took his small flicks of fish. He drank from her silver cup. He sat for a while on the napkin afterwards and watched the candles and seemed to think. In the days that followed, a pattern settled into place. The frog spent the mornings in the garden. He sat on the moss by the well, in the shade of the linden, and watched the bees. Elise often sat there too. She brought a book sometimes and read aloud bits of it she liked, and the frog listened with his head a little tipped to one side. Sometimes she did not read. Sometimes she only sat and tossed the golden ball gently from hand to hand, low and slow, never high enough that it might roll again. In the afternoons, the frog sat on the wide sill of the kitchen window and watched the cook work. The cook was a broad, slow woman with quick hands. She rolled out pastry on the long, pale table. She trimmed the green beans. She turned the joints of meat on their long iron hooks. The frog watched all of it. He sat very still. Once or twice the cook left a small saucer of milk for him on the corner of the table, and he drank from it carefully, in small, tidy swallows, the way he had drunk from Elise's silver cup. In the evenings he came to supper. He sat at her plate. He ate his small portion. He drank from her cup. He went with her in her cupped hands along the corridor to her bedchamber, and he slept on the pillow beside hers. And in those evenings, very slowly, something changed. It was nothing one could quite point to. The cast of pink along his throat grew slightly clearer. The gold rings around his eyes seemed to widen very gradually until you could see the dark gold colour of his iris within. His back, which had been green-brown, took on a deeper green, the colour of the linden leaves at high summer. He grew, just a little. On the 5th night, he was perhaps the size of her fist still. On the 10th night, he was perhaps the size of her 2 hands held side by side. None of them remarked on it. Not Elise, not the king, not the sisters, not the steward. They had all agreed somehow, without any of them having said so, that this was not a thing to remark on. It was a slow thing that no one wanted to look at directly. It was the cook who first said the thing aloud. She said it on the morning of the 14th day, while she was rolling out pastry on the long, pale table. The frog was on his sill. He was watching the rolling pin. He was by now the size of a small cat. "He is becoming someone," the cook said. She said it to no one in particular. She said it to the pastry. Someone he used to be. The cook's boy, who was wiping the corners of the table behind her, did not look up. "Yes," he said. "I think so." The transformation, when it finished very quietly. It finished on a warm evening near the end of summer. The bees in the linden were slower now. The lavender beds had gone faintly grey at the heads. The light over the kitchen garden was the colour of pale gold linen. Elise had gone to bed early. She had been tired all day, with the kind of tiredness that did not have a cause. The frog, who was now nearly the size of a fox, had come with her. He hadn't been able to sit on the pillow for some days. He had taken instead to sleeping on the soft wool rug at the foot of the bed. Elise hadn't minded. The rug had been her grandmother's, and she liked to think the wool kept him a little warm in the cool of the night. She fell asleep quickly. She slept deeply. She didn't dream, or if she did, she didn't remember it. When she woke, the room was full of grey pre-dawn light, and the candle had burned out, and the window was open to the cool last hour of the night. Somewhere in the linden tree, the first thrush of the morning was beginning to sing. At the foot of the bed, where the wool rug had been, there sat a young man. He was perhaps 18, or perhaps a little older. He had dark hair, slightly damp at the ends. He had a thin, pale face and dark, gold-ringed eyes. He was wearing a soft, grey-green tunic of a cut Elise did not quite know, and his feet were bare on the cool stone floor. He was sitting very still, in the way she had grown used to over the long summer. He was looking at his own hands as though he had not seen them in a long time. He looked up when she sat up. He didn't speak at once. "Princess," he said after a little while. His voice was the same. It was very slightly less damp. "Yes," said Elise. "I am sorry," he said, "that it took so long." Elise did not say anything for a moment. Then she got out of bed and she walked across the cool stone floor, and she sat down on the rug beside him. The thrush in the linden sang again. Somewhere in the kitchen yard a door opened, and someone walked across the gravel with a pail. The light at the window was beginning to take on a pale blue. "What was your name?" she said. "Before." "Lucas," he said. "Lucas," said Elise. She tried the word once, gently. "That is a good name." "It used to be," said Lucas. He was still looking at his hands. She left those questions for another time. How it had happened, how long, whether he wanted now to leave. There was time enough for all of that, and she had grown, over the long summer, into the habit of not asking things that did not need to be asked. She asked instead if he was hungry, and he said yes, a little. So they got up, and they went very quietly down through the still palace to the kitchen, where the cook was already up and laying the fire. The cook looked at them once, and at Lucas in his soft grey-green tunic, and at his dark hair still slightly damp at the ends, and she nodded the way she had nodded at the pastry. She set out bread and butter, and a small dish of honey, and a clay pitcher of milk, and she went on with the fire. They ate at the long, pale table. Lucas held the bread carefully in both hands, as though he had not held bread in a long time. He ate slowly. He drank his milk from a small white cup. The first sun came in through the kitchen window and fell across the table in a long, pale stripe, and the linden outside moved a little in the morning air, and the bees, who had been up before any of them, were already at work in the upper branches. The king, when he came in some hours later, did not seem surprised. He greeted Lucas as one greets an expected guest. He asked after his family. Lucas told him, in a quiet voice, of a small kingdom 3 days' ride to the east, and of a mother who would be old now, and of a father who was perhaps no longer living. The king listened in his careful way, and said that messengers would be sent that very afternoon, and that there would be no hurry, and that Lucas might stay as long as he liked. Lucas stayed. The messengers came back in time with the news that his mother was indeed still living, and that she had not given up looking for him, and that she wept, the messengers said, when she heard. She came herself, before the leaves had quite turned. She was a small, grey-haired woman with the same dark, gold-ringed eyes. She held her son's face in her hands for a long time without speaking. Then she sat at the king's long table, and she ate the leek soup, and she thanked the cook, and she stayed 3 weeks. The wedding, when it came, was small. It was a quieter wedding than the storybooks like. There was a quiet hour in the long hall on a still autumn afternoon. The light came in through the south windows and fell across the Queen's portrait for the usual hour. The king stood at the head of the table. The eldest princess and the middle sister stood beside Elise. Lucas's small grey-haired mother stood on his other side. The cook had made a pale cake with honey and almonds. There was a single jug of cider from the orchard. The steward stood by the door with his hands behind his back. Elise wore a pale green gown. She carried in her hand the golden ball. She had thought about this for some time. She had decided that the ball, which had begun this whole long, quiet summer, should be part of its ending. She set it down on the table beside the cake. The afternoon sun caught it once, and the gold went very briefly bright, and then the light moved on. Later, when the small supper was done, and the king had gone to his rooms, and the sisters had gone to theirs, and Lucas's mother had been settled in the south guest chamber with a warm brick at her feet, Elise and Lucas walked out together into the garden. It was cold now. The lavender had been cut back. The box hedges were dark in the dusk. The linden had lost most of its leaves, and the bare branches made a fine, pale net against the deepening sky. The first stars were beginning to come out, one and then another. They walked slowly down the grass path to the well. The well was just as it had been. The pale moss on the stones, the wide, dark mouth, the wooden cover tilted across one side. Elise leaned over the rim. The water at the bottom was a small, dark coin of starlight now. It looked, she thought, exactly as it had looked on the summer afternoon when the ball had first fallen in, except that there were no bees overhead, and the air smelled of cold leaves instead of honey. She took the golden ball from the pouch at her wrist. She held it a moment in her palm. It was just as heavy as it had always been. It still smelled very faintly of stone and of clean, cold water. She set it down very gently on the moss at the rim of the well, where the frog had once sat with his small front feet placed neatly on the stone. She left it there. They walked back up the grass path together. The lamps in the south windows of the palace were lit, one by one, as the steward went along the inside of the long hall. The first owl called from the forest. The linden moved a little in the cold air, and a single late leaf came down and turned twice and settled in the grass. In her bedchamber that night, Elise lay on her side of the bed, and Lucas lay on his. The candle on the small table burned steadily. The window above the writing desk was open a finger's width, and the cool night air came in, smelling of stone and of cut grass, and of the linden's last faint honey. Somewhere, far down the corridor, a door closed softly. Somewhere in the kitchen, a small spoon tapped the side of a bowl, and then was still. Outside, in the dark garden, the golden ball sat on the moss at the rim of the well. The starlight moved very slowly across it. The water at the bottom of the well held the small reflection of one star. The linden bent a little in the cold air, and bent back. And in the warm, small room at the top of the south corridor, the princess and the young man who had once been a frog lay quietly side by side, and the candle burned a little lower, and the night went on around them, soft and slow and very old. The candle dimmed. The window stayed open a finger's width. Outside, the linden bent once and was still.